Welcome, folks, to Crypto News Global. I'm your host, Nick Toka. On today's show, El Salvador is still Bitcoin country, regardless of what the IMF says. Also, Bitcoin ETF, the 8th largest U.S. bank, PNC, declares they have 67 million in exposure. And our feature story of today, more states proposed legislation to establish a Bitcoin reserve. Today we have Maryland, Iowa, and Kentucky joining the club. All this and so much more on today's show. Welcome, folks, to Crypto News Global. I'm your host, Nick Toka. Today is February 7th, 2025, and Bitcoin is hitting its stride, sitting at about 96,500, down 1%. Another day of sideways action. Let's get right into the market watch and Bitcoin technical analysis to get a closer look at what's happening. Here we have Bitcoin 96,500, Ethereum down 3%, 2636, Solana down 1.5% at 191, XRP up 0.75% at $2.37, and Doge another down day at down 2% at 24.5 cents currently. Let's get a different perspective using the crypto bubbles. We have a mixed bag, about a 60-40 red over green. We have PLSX, which I haven't seen before, up 33%. PLS up 13%. Ultima up 8.4%. Hex up 11.5%. On the downside, Bear up 15% down. Move down 11%. WIF down 7.5%. LDO down 11%. Zooming out to the weekly, we have almost everything in the red for the week. We have Ultima, one of only 4 greens that I could see. Ultima up 35%. PLSX up 10%, OM up 12%, and pretty much everything else is in the red. And they're all almost equally red. Equally have gone down quite a bit. So we've got, Trump coin notably 32%, Bonk 33%, Doge 25%, Shiba 20%, INJ 35%. Jasmy 35%. Pretty much everywhere we look, we're down 25 to 35% on the week. Let's hope this turns around, but certainly a good buy the dip opportunity for everybody. And going out to the monthly, we have XCN coin at up 980%, PLSX up 35%. And this must be a bit of a new coin. We'll check it out in a little bit deeper. Ultima up 31%, DEX up 40% for the month. And let's check for the year. I guess it's not a new coin, but the price is still nice and cheap, isn't it? If we go to the daily view, so 1, 2, 3, 4 zeros. Yeah. A lot of times, well, it's down in the last hour, 4.5%. But some of these coins that are, 0.00000, and they're up substantially. Pulse X. When I talk about putting 90-95% of your money into more stable coins like Bitcoin. I do also suggest that keeping 5% or 10%, and for the super volatile stuff. And I also recommend about doing that in the standard financial industry as well, financial markets. Put your money in something that is not going to lose your capital, but will gain, a fair percentage. In crypto, we're talking Bitcoin. And keep 5%. Put it in some of these shit coins. Take a chance. And you never know. Some of these shit coins might be the ones that actually make you a quick buck. And if you do, you put in $50 and make a couple thousand, well, maybe you move that into Bitcoin, or maybe you move half of it into Bitcoin, and then you've got, instead of 50 or $100 that you started with in these little shit coins, maybe now you've got $1,000 you can play with. And the next time you hit it lucky on one of these little new coins, these ICOs, then maybe instead of making $2 or $3 grand, maybe you make 10 or 20 grand, and you kind of keep playing that game. But I definitely promote long-term growth, long-term hodling, and this is where I really think that your money is going to be made on a solid long-term outlook. Our crypto market cap is Bitcoin right now at 1.9 trillion, Ethereum at 317 billion, XRP at 137 billion, Solana at 93 billion, Doge at 36 billion, Cardano 24 billion, Tron at 19.7 billion. Checking out the total market cap right now is 3.08 trillion, down about 10 billion from yesterday. The Bitcoin market cap is the highest I have seen, very close to 62% of the total crypto market right now. Ethereum down to 10.3%. XRP up a little bit, 4.5% of the total crypto market, and Solana holding steady at 3% of the total crypto market. Crypto Fear and Greed Index, currently we have a 44 in neutral. Yesterday also 44 in neutral, and last week was a 68 in greed. So I mentioned this quite a bit. When we see a neutral or low number here, we should anticipate some kind of bullish tenon and something coming up bullish. When the price is low, generally what happens is, a bunch of whales put their money in because they're getting it at a good price. They're dollar cost averaging, or they're just, buying low, selling high, and then waiting for the cycle to repeat. So 44 is pretty low, and with that, I probably expect a bit of a pump if we're going to look at a more of a micro instead of macro outlook. There are approximately 1,160 days until the next Bitcoin halving, and there are 167,179 blocks left to mine until that halving, and we have 1,178,685 blocks left to mine until the final block of Bitcoin is mined in the year 2140. The total market cap by commodity and company worldwide, we have gold at 19.3 trillion, still way ahead in spot number one. Apple number two, 3.4 trillion. Nvidia 3.2 trillion. Microsoft 3 trillion. Amazon 2.4 trillion. Alphabet, Google 2.3 trillion. Bitcoin holding steady at 1.9 trillion. Silver 1.8 trillion. Meta 1.8 10 billion below 10 billion above Meta. Silver's 10 billion above Meta right now. Silver at 1.811 trillion and Meta 1.810. So there might be some flippening happening there. Saudi Aramco down to the number 10 position now at 1.78 trillion, right ahead of Tesla at 1.16 trillion. And you can currently get 1,026 Satoshis for one fiat US dollar. And speaking of the US dollar, there are a lot of them owed. $36,452 billion in the national debt. That's up approximately $4 billion from yesterday. That equals to $107,137 per citizen and $323,000 per U.S. taxpayer. So the debt keeps going up. The debt ceiling is probably going to be increased soon. I believe they're going to have to make a new proposal in the Senate based on a completely new budget. And they're going to have to increase the debt ceiling for what Trump is trying to do. We'll see how that comes across, or if he's actually going to do it. But in order to fund his plans of, repatriating all these endeavors, bringing all the companies back locally instead of being outsourced to all these different countries, they're going to have to spend a lot of money locally. And to do that, I've heard it's going to run approximately $5+ trillion to start these initiatives, which means that the debt ceiling will have to increase, which means more money printing, which means more money debasement, which means more Bitcoin pumpage. One country that has adopted Bitcoin and has been doing amazingly since adopting it is El Salvador. And we have our headline here: El Salvador is still Bitcoin country. Bitcoin may no longer be legal tender in El Salvador, but Bitcoiners in the country haven't given up on the mission. So we'll go through the article in a second, but the idea here is that the IMF first, when El Salvador announced that they were going to accept Bitcoin as their national currency along with the US dollar, the IMF and a whole bunch of critics basically said don't do it, and kind of made fun of them and said you're going to ruin your country. Instead, the exact opposites happened, and the country's booming. The crime has gone from the murder capital of the world to the safest country in the Americas. They locked up all the lowlives and threw them in these new high-tech jails, which house many, many people. In fact, they have offered last week to allow prisoners from the U.S. to get into their jails, which I don't know if they're allowed to do that. I think it goes against some kind of international treaty. But they did offer it, so again, it put them on the map. So the story here is that the IMF at one point, when they started to, when El Salvador started to use Bitcoin, start hodling Bitcoin as a reserve, IMF was like, no, don't do that. And El Salvador was like, yes, we're doing it. And they've done it for, I think, 4 or 5 years now. And now the IMF recently, about a couple months ago, came back and said, we still want to push this loan on you. Would you like the loan? And El Salvador said, okay, fine. IMF said, we'll give you the money, but you have to stop using Bitcoin stop forcing everybody to use Bitcoin as a legal tender. Now, El Salvador was never forcing everybody. This is where the IMF are idiots. You think that with all their money, with all their pushiness, they would do a little more investigation. You'd think that somebody would step foot in El Salvador and check this out, but clearly nobody did, because from what I understand, it was never forced on anybody. There were some companies that would accept Bitcoin and the US dollar, and other companies that were only accepting US dollar, and probably some other companies that were only accepting Bitcoin. So it was all voluntary, and it still is. Contrary to the FUD that the IMF is feeding in the news stories. Bitcoin may no longer be legal tender in El Salvador, but Bitcoiners in the country haven't given up on the mission. El Salvador is still a Bitcoin country, despite the fact that Bitcoin is no longer a legal tender in the country, at least from where I'm sitting. Let's start with some background on the matter. On January 29, 2025, the Legislative Assembly in El Salvador voted to remove Bitcoin's status as a legal tender. This means that the businesses in the country no longer have to accept Bitcoin. Not that this rule was ever strictly enforced while Bitcoin was classified as a legal currency, as far as I know, which is what I was saying. However, I've been told that the big businesses that operate in the country, example, McDonald's, Walmart, may stop accepting Bitcoin as payment now, which could have a detrimental effect on adoption. This change occurred approximately 1 month after the International Monetary Fund struck a deal with authorities in El Salvador that stipulated the following. El Salvador would receive $1.4 billion loan to support the government's reform agenda. Bitcoin-related risks be mitigated. Bitcoin acceptance in the private sector must be voluntary, while the public sector's participation in Bitcoin-related activities would be confined. Bitcoin can no longer be used to settle government debt or pay taxes. So, exactly what I was saying. Bitcoin acceptance in the private sector must be voluntary. It always was voluntary. And if IMF, not surprisingly, nobody does their homework. They're just greedy. Operations for the government created Bitcoin wallet Chivo would be unwound. So this Chivo wallet was something that was not widely used, from what I understand anyway, so really there's no change. Effectively, El Salvador received $1.4 billion, and they didn't really have to make any changes. Now, what they have changed is they use that $1.4 billion to buy more Bitcoin. So they're kind of using the sailor put, which is brilliant. While the news from the Salvadorian government reversing its policy on Bitcoin as legal tender as a result of influence from the IMF feels like a gut punch even to me. Someone who isn't Salvadorian and doesn't live in the country, I can't help but believe that El Salvador is still Bitcoin country. Yep. And this feeling has only grown stronger based on what I've seen Bitcoiners in El Salvador posting on X. Evelyn Lemus, co-founder and director of education at Bitcoin Berlin, a Bitcoin circular economy within the country, doesn't plan to stop teaching everyday Salvadorians about Bitcoin. The team at BitDriver don't plan to change their business model, accepting Bitcoin as taxi fare anytime soon. While John Dinihi, founder of Me Primer Bitcoin, expressed concern about the government of El Salvador's rolling back its policy on Bitcoin as a legal currency, he and the ever-growing team at Me Primer Bitcoin plan to double down on the work they're doing. The legendary Max and Stacy haven't publicly voiced any plans to give up on El Salvador anytime soon, and El Salvador's Bitcoin office run by Stacy is still stacking Bitcoin and helping to run the Bitcoin education programs in the country. The lesson here is that while the law around Bitcoin may have changed in El Salvador, the Bitcoiners on the ground in the country have hardly flinched. because we are Bitcoin. What matters most is the everyday Salvadorians, and everyone else involved in Bitcoin movement in El Salvador continues to push forward with the Bitcoin mission. The IMF may have landed a blow, but Bitcoiners in El Salvador remain steadfast in their efforts to foster broader Bitcoin adoption. El Salvador is still Bitcoin country. Yeah, 100% it's still Bitcoin country, and nothing's really changed. They're still stacking. In fact, they are buying more than they ever have now with this additional, $1.5 billion that the IMF gave them. So good on them. I think they're doing the right thing. They are effectively using the sailor put. They're borrowing money at virtually no interest, and they're buying Bitcoin with it. Bitcoin's going to go up in price, and then when it's time to pay the loan back, they'll have already hopefully doubled, tripled, 5x their money. Some of the banks also in the States are making some headlines because on the low, some banks have been investing in Bitcoin and not saying anything, I suppose, to keep away from the SEC. So we have the 8th largest U.S. bank, PNC. They have declared that they have $67 million in Bitcoin ETFs. The adoption of the spot ETF product is at an all-time high with PNC. A top 8 U.S. bank unveil its exposure in 13F filing. American, 8th largest U.S. bank, has declared exposure to Bitcoin ETF. The bank has bought $67 million in the ETF product. BlackRock upped its stake in IBET amid growing adoption. So it's the 8th largest bank in the U.S., which I don't know if I've ever heard of these guys, PNC, but 8th largest bank. The spot Bitcoin ETF market just witnessed PNC, the 8th largest bank in the United States, declare its exposure to BTC. As revealed via its 13F filing with the SEC, PNC, with $325 billion in assets under management, said it has exposure to Bitcoin worth $67 million. Bitcoin ETF adoption among banks are growing. According to former Sequoia Capital analyst Julian Ferher, PNC increased its stake in BTC ETFs over 1 year. The financial giant upped its stake from $10 million to $67 million per the 13F filing. It invested the funds into Bitwise and BT ETF. Beyond PNC, top banks in the United States are gaining increasing backing for Bitcoin ETF products. Previous reports hinted that Wells Fargo, Morgan Stanley, and BNP Paribas are heavily invested in these products. Amid the 13F filing, BlackRock, the issuer of the iShares eTrust IBIT, also increased its stake in the fund. As Farher noted, the BlackRock IBIT allocation has jumped from $92 million in November to, $140 million today. Many analysts believe that these top corporate buyers are strategic in their ETF bets. The fund market first anniversary with a huge milestone serving as a pointer to its maturity. BTC ETF and quest for in-kind redemption. This was an interesting story that we covered 2-3 weeks ago. Data from Farside investors show that Bitcoin ETF products have amassed $40 billion in inflows since they launched, with records that prove faster growth than other comparative ETFs like gold. Issuers are now eyeing key changes. BlackRock has moved to demand in-kind redemption for IBIT, a request lodged with the U.S. SEC earlier this month. The current cash creates models sees investors receive proceeds from their BTC ETF funds through the U.S. dollar. With in-kind redemption, direct BTC payouts will be possible. Other asset managers like Fidelity Investments are now joining this trend, showcasing the next phase of growth for the ETF. So what that means is when these ETFs came out, all of them, the Gensler and the SEC said, yes, we'll approve your ETFs. However, it has to be cash in, cash out. So if you're an investor, you would buy, whatever, 0.1 Bitcoin, and you would give them 10 grand. They would buy, BlackRock would buy, or any of the ETF companies would buy your Bitcoin. They would custody the Bitcoin with, in most cases, Coinbase. In every case, actually, except for Fidelity, Coinbase was the holder of all the Bitcoin. Then, if you wanted your money back, okay, Bitcoin went up, so now I made 5 grand, I want my 5 grand back, and you went to BlackRock and said, I take out my money, you would get cash back. So you'd get 15,000 all in cash. You'd put the cash in, you'd get the cash out. Now it seems much more favorable in which respect that you will get the Bitcoin back. And isn't that what everybody wants? So I like this demand in kind redemption for IBIT. And excuse me, guys, a little late here, Eastern time zone. So it's good, and this is what we want. We want to be able to buy Bitcoin and actually get Bitcoin, not pay with cash. Assume they're buying some Bitcoin for you and then get some cash back, because what is cash good for? At least this way you get your Bitcoin back. They'll probably make it so you can trade Bitcoin. So if you've got Bitcoin on an exchange, you can go into the ETF, and then when it's time for you to take your money out, you will get your Bitcoin back. So why would somebody want to do this, you ask? Because everybody knows, not your cheese, not your keys, not your cheese. So effectively, if you're not self-custodying the Bitcoin, then you're not really owning it. And so why would somebody want to do this? Tax implications, 100%. You can put that ETF in a tax-sheltered account, so you would not pay any tax on any of the capital gains. Another reason for it is organizations can then more easily invest their money in they're allowed to invest in traditional financial mediums, stocks, bonds, ETFs, mutual funds, but not Bitcoin directly, not any of the meme coins, not any crypto, period. So they could then use this ETF like another financial account. So then they can actually get exposure to Bitcoin, which is what these banks are doing, right? As we saw in our last article. So they can get exposure to Bitcoin, but still be covered under the, in government insurance for financial assets. So it does make sense in some situations. If you want to avoid the taxes, it's not a bad idea to go into a tax-sheltered account, go with the ETF, hope and pray that Bitcoin doesn't pull the rug out on everybody and are in cahoots with the government. So interesting. And there's definitely more interesting news coming out of the States, and it seems that we are now up to 17 states that have started a legislation to propose a Bitcoin strategic reserve. So the number keeps going up. Maryland, Iowa, Kentucky now also propose a legislation to establish a Bitcoin reserve. As seen here, lawmakers in Maryland, Iowa, Kentucky have introduced legislation to proposing a creation of a Bitcoin strategic reserve in their respective states. The latest bill brings the number of U.S. states considering Bitcoin reserves to 17. The proposal aims to integrate Bitcoin into the state financial strategies. Kentucky House Bill 376, introduced by Representative T.J. Roberts, aims to revise the state's financial practices by expanding investment options for excess state funds. The bill amends the regulations governing the State Investment Commission and authorizes investments in various asset classes, including digital assets, U.S. government-backed obligations, and collateralized certificates of deposit. The digital assets must have a market cap of at least $750 billion, averaged over the previous calendar year. Only Bitcoin meets the requirement as of February 2025, while Ethereum does not due to its $320 billion market cap. The bill stipulates that the investment cannot exceed 10% of the state's funds' total excess cash. It allows state agencies to accept payments in digital assets and bullion while prohibiting the use of central bank digital currencies. Additionally, the legislation will allow state retirement funds and deferred compensation plans to invest in exchange-traded products. So this is great. Cannot exceed 10% of the state's funds excess in cash. This makes sense because as much as we want to put our money into Bitcoin, the states can't just say we're going to put 100% of our money into Bitcoin. No, they have to start slowly, and they need to diversify. So it makes sense, 10%. You know, if every state is putting 10%, that's a hell of a lot of money. That adds up. The bill establishes a framework for handling recipients of digital assets, ensuring conversion into U.S. currency when necessary. State agencies are authorized to promulgate regulations overseeing these investments. Maryland and Iowa joined Bitcoin race as well. Maryland's House Bill 1389, introduced the Representative Caitlin Young, proposed the establishment of the Maryland Bitcoin Reserve Fund. This initiative will position Bitcoin as a reserve asset for the state. The legislation grants the state treasury authority to invest funds obtained by enforcing certain gambling violations into Bitcoin, making it a unique approach to digital asset accumulation. Meanwhile, Iowa House File 246, introduced by Representative Taylor Collins, outlines investment allowances for the state treasurer. The bill permits investments in precious metals and digital assets with a market capitalization exceeding $750 billion, averaged over the previous year. It also allows investments in stable coins. So Iowa is very similar to Kentucky. The only difference is Iowa is a little more lenient. They're also allowing stable coins, but they also do require that it has to be a market cap of at least $750 billion. So it's the same category. Bitcoin's the only one that qualifies here. The state's general fund, cash reserve fund, and Iowa Economic and Emergency Fund are eligible to make such investments. The bill cap digital assets investment at 5% of the public funds available at the time of investment. So that's where they differ. Iowa is only allowing 5%, and Kentucky is allowing up to 10%. However, this is fantastic news. So now we have 15 states out of the 50. So now we're getting, at some point it was 20%. Now we're starting to get close to, almost 50% of the states who have filed for their own Bitcoin reserve. I mean, it's not 50, it's about 35 right now. But it's starting to get pretty close. So I'll give you an exact amount. It's 30, yeah, I was close. It's 34% of all the U.S. states now have legislation in place, proposed legislation that is now, it needs to be approved by the Senate. But it's there, and I think pretty soon we're going to start seeing some of these states get approved for Bitcoin ETFs, and then the crowd's going to go wild, and I think Bitcoin's going to go jump up in price, and I think we're all going to benefit from something like this. Financial literacy, guys, is very important. Make sure when dealing with your finances, you are holding on to your money. You're not throwing it all away. Live within your own means. Don't live off debt. Don't live off credit cards. Try not to have loans. Sometimes it's tough with the whole car thing, and you're driving a crap heap, and everybody else is driving a beautiful ride, but what you might not be seeing on the other end is the guy or lady with the beautiful ride is knee deep or waist deep or neck deep in debt, and you find you may be living a little frugally now, but in the long run it's going to pay off because you're not living off any kind of debt. You're living within your means. Money, at some point, if you play it like this, money will become abundant because money is everywhere. There's $700 trillion in the world. Time is what's scarce, everybody, and use that time wisely. If you start making more money all of a sudden, don't start spending more money. Start saving more money, and start saving when you're young. Start saving when you're 18, 20 years old, and you can retire when you're 40, 45 and not have to wait until you're too old to enjoy the greater things in life. Hopefully you found this stream enjoyable. If you did, please share, comment, and subscribe, and we will see you on the next stream. Thanks for joining, folks.